up with yours before they figure out what they're doing.
My words moved down. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I see that.
You already.
Everyone, let us give our attention to Sarah. Let me get by you here.
Okay.
And, she's going to talk about the apostles. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I have chapter 2 of Eusebius, which was on the apostles. And we all know that Jesus had 12 disciples, that is, until Judas betrayed him and later hung himself. So then we were down to 11 disciples. And so after Judas died, after Jesus was resurrected, the apostles decided to replace him with Matthias. And then, yes. So there were 7 men who were deacons and were appointed to oversee the apostles' fund. And their leader was Stephen, who was the first martyr for Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, who was also
stoned.
Yes, after he was also known as James the Just and author of the book of James. He was the first bishop in Jerusalem. Let's see. After Stephen's death, the apostles were kind of scattered about across the world, and Philip, who was not one of the disciples but was a deacon, was the first to preach the gospel in Samaria. He was also the first to convert a Gentile to Christ. He then, which we know from Acts 8. I'm not going to talk much about Tiberius because, according to the author, Eusebius' account's not completely accurate. There were some details that were a little bit mixed up. So, however, after he died, Gaius, also known as Caligula, became the emperor, and he was not as friendly towards the Jews as his predecessor. Philo, who wrote 5 books during this time, was a very accomplished writer, and he wrote about all that happened to the Jews during Gaius' reign. He wrote that Caligula seized several Jewish synagogues and filled them with his own image, and even tried to turn a temple in Jerusalem into a shrine to himself. Philo believed that the reason the Jews suffered so much during this era was a punishment for the way they treated Christ. See, after Caligula came Claudius, who was his nephew, and under his rule there was a famine in Rome. And we see a good example of the early church being the church during this time because they would send aid through Paul and Barnabas to help the people in Rome. During this time, Herod Agrippa had James, not the brother of Jesus, executed, and intended to do the same with Peter, but as we know from Acts 5, Peter was able to escape through divine help. Speaking of divine, Agrippa was divinely punished when he was at a feast in Caesarea. He was giving a speech, and he was struck by an angel of the Lord, consumed by worms, and died.
You know, I hate it when that happens.
That's a bad way to die. Simon Magus was a sorcerer possessed by demons and led many astray with his teachings. However, it was shut down quickly by Peter, who was considered to be a leader among the apostles. I imagine it was situations like this, plus the fact that they just simply weren't satisfied with a singular message, that people wanted to have a written summary of the teachings of Christ. Therefore, Mark wrote what we now know as the Gospel of Mark. He was also the first to preach the gospel in Egypt and the first to plant churches in Alexandria. Speaking of Alexandria, going back to Philo, as I mentioned earlier, he was a very accomplished writer, and his writings covered a variety of topics, including philosophy, religion, history, and moral problems. He wrote accounts of the apostles' early work in the church, and they align with what we know about the early church from Scripture, including that many would sell all they had and use that money to put towards the apostles' work, which we read about in Acts 4. And another thing the book mentioned is that they encouraged one another with scripture, songs, and hymns, which reminded me of something that I read in both Colossians and Ephesians. But things were not always peaceful in Jerusalem. When Claudius was emperor, a riot broke out during the Feast of Passover, and over 30,000 people were trampled to death. Under Nero, a quarrel ignited between the chief priests, and they started stoning one another. There were also thieves who would mingle in the crowds in Jerusalem and would stab their victims and then act shocked when they fell over, like they didn't have anything to do with it. So the first victim actually happened to be a high priest named Jonathan. There was also an Egyptian false prophet who was leading a group of followers to the Mount of Olives and planning on invading Jerusalem and overpowering the Roman government. But his plan was foiled by Felix, who was the procurator at the time, and the battle broke out. The Egyptian was able to escape, however, many of his followers were not. I got a little bit confused with Paul's imprisonments. He had been a prisoner in Rome before he was brought to trial before Festus, and there he asked to appeal to Caesar. So there he gave his testimony before both Festus and Agrippa, and according to Acts 26, Agrippa says that if Paul had not appealed to Caesar, he would have been set free. But then Paul ends up sailing back to Rome and preaching the gospel there for a few more years.
So Eusebius says he was a prisoner in Rome and tried like Festus, or he'd been a prisoner of Rome?
I guess he may have been of Rome.
Yeah,
I was a little confused a bit.
Yeah, he's a prisoner at Caesarea.
Okay.
Under Felix and Festus. And then they're going to let him go. Well, they probably would have let him go. But he had made the appeal to Caesar, and that's when he gets sent to Rome.
Okay.
And that's when he has a shipwreck and everything on the way. It takes him a long time to get there. But that emperor is Nero.
But whenever he did sail back, was he in prison, or was he kind of like able...
Well, he was a prisoner.
Okay. But he wasn't actually, like...
Yeah, I mean, he was in prison in Caesarea. Then a guard was assigned to him to take him, at least one guard, and maybe some others, to Rome. And so along the way, they have to find their way there. It's not a dedicated transport thing, so they're just getting on different boats to take them there. And they have a shipwreck. And that's where, Paul actually tells them they're going to have a shipwreck, and then they do. And then they have to recover from the shipwreck, and then they finally make it to Rome. Yeah. So I think I would say he was a prisoner of Rome, and then later a prisoner in Rome. That would make it, I think, fit better. And I think that's probably what Eusebius means there.
Because there was a period of time that he wasn't, between the two imprisonments, that he wasn't actually in jail, but was still preaching in Rome, right?
Well, yeah, okay, so if we're talking about the chronology of Paul, of course some people debate some of the details, but as I understand it anyway, all right, Paul has 3 missionary journeys, right? After the 3 missionary journeys, he comes back to Israel, Palestine, with an offering. He goes to Jerusalem. There, people are disturbed by him being there. It causes problems. He gets arrested because the Romans don't like any disruption. He is then, since he is a citizen, transported out to Caesarea, which was sort of the provincial capital. There he is put on trial, and he appeals to Rome. He's still held at Caesarea, and then what happens is they change the ruler there, the judge, and when the judge then, I think, wants to clear up his books, like the new guy's coming in, here's all this stuff left over from the other guy, why is this guy still here? Because there was controversy as to what to do with Paul, but he had appealed to Rome, so he said, okay, send him to Rome. Get him out of here. I don't have to worry about him, see? Then on his way to Rome, of course, that's when he has his famous shipwreck, and, the snake, think about the snake, right, biting him and all those other kinds of things that happen. He ends up in Rome. He goes to Nero. What most people believe is then Nero released him.
Okay.
Okay? He is released, and then he goes and does some other work. What some people believe, and I think there is some evidence, is he actually goes to Spain, which might be an actual some people say Paul had a 4th missionary journey to the west. But that's not recorded in the book of Acts. But he does talk about that he wanted to go to Spain, and talking about going to Spain.
Wasn't Spain called a different name back then?
In Romans, he says that.
In Romans, yeah. And so the idea is that he did go, some people believe he did go to Spain. I kind of think he probably did go to Spain, but, then I'm a radical.
Wasn't Spain called a different name back then, just like,
They called it España.
They called France Gaul back then.
Well, yes.
Spain did not even exist until like...
And then after that, still under the reign of Nero, there's the persecutions of Christians, and the persecutions begin after the fire in Rome which is 64. And then Paul is arrested again, although that's not in the Bible either. He is arrested again and then executed around 67. So that would bring him back to Rome, no doubt there, and executed by beheading. Yes?
So would his prison epistles then be, like right before he dies, like first and second Timothy, that would be after he returns back under house arrest?
Yes, at least the way I build Paul's chronology,
Sure.
the prison epistles are his second imprisonment in Rome,
Sure. Okay.
right before his execution, because he tells Timothy in 2 Timothy that basically, this is it. Come and see me, bring me a cloak, bring my books, all that kind of stuff that he says at the end. And most people believe that's the very end of his life, and then he's executed. So, although some people put it all in just one imprisonment, and he's imprisoned, and then I guess he's executed after that. But there's no record of his execution. So, okay, so yeah, it does. There is some, since it's not clear cut in the book of Acts, then there are some questions. But part of what you have to do is rebuild the sort of chronology of the New Testament and the chronology of Paul within that. So that's sort of the way I rebuild it. Not everybody would agree with me, but I would put his 2 imprisonments, and the second imprisonment would then lead to his execution. And that would be when the prison epistles are written.
Okay. So that was under Nero.
Yeah. Everybody agrees it's all under Nero. So we're only talking about a difference of a couple of years, but we are talking about a difference of 1 or 2 imprisonments. If you go with the 2 imprisonments, because you've got basically from 64 to 67 between the fire and his execution, most people put that gives plenty of time for Paul to say go to the west to Spain, or maybe go back and visit the churches again, or whatever he was doing during that time, that is not recorded by Luke in the book of Acts. But some people say, well, the book of Acts ends abruptly and Luke just doesn't record his death, and then that's it. So I will plead departmental immunity on any further things. I'm not in that department, so you can talk to them. I'm sure they have completely different ideas. But, since I'm a history guy, I like to try to build a chronology. And since I actually think the text is correct, I try to build it around that. Okay, we'll go from there. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So with
You got
Paul
more, right?
in Rome, the Jews
James.
decided to
we're
focus
just now up to
James.
James. Oh, I'm sorry.
And let's see, which James are we on at this point?
This is the brother of Jesus. it says.
Okay, so the brother of Jesus.
Yeah.
So Festus has just died. He was the procurator at the time. So now they didn't have a procurator
Right.
when James.
That's the same guy that judges Paul.
Right.
Yeah.
So they decided to bring James before the Sanhedrin and asked him to deny Christ. Of course, he refused. So they decided to stone him. But as they were stoning him, James cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing."
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. As I mentioned, when Paul was in prison the second time, it was under Nero. And Nero was a much more violent ruler. He even had members of his family killed. And he was probably, of all the emperors, the one that was most against God and Christianity, from my understanding. But, let me find the right notes.
Certainly in the first century, I'd say. Yeah. Well, Domitian was pretty bad, too. Diocletian, that's much later. The first century, I'm talking. Yeah, go ahead. We're interrupted. She's not
That's
gonna
fine. But as you mentioned earlier, in 64, there was a fire, and even though it was Nero's fault, he blamed the Christians and decided to have them punished for it. So that was when a lot of persecution began. And it was under his rule that Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified. And then in 66, the Jews, and again, I could be wrong about this part, those revolted against the Roman government, and I believe it was in protest of taxation. There's probably other factors that contributed to it as well. But the Roman government responded by going into the cities and rounding up the rebels. And according to Josephus, they had many of the more high-ranking Jews flogged or crucified. And this was the start of the Jewish War, also known as the Great Revolt.
Right.
And then that's all I have.
That's it. Any questions?
After Matthias replaced him as a disciple, but like, was his role and like job is exactly the same thing what they planned for Judas or whatever?
I'm not sure if it's the same because this was after Jesus was resurrected, obviously, so their roles, I think, as apostles, a little bit different than before.
Yeah, I would say that basically he's a replacement apostle. So what they do is they make up a list of people who met the requirements to be an apostle, and some of those were being with Jesus since the beginning. So he had been there since the beginning. So my guess is he had the authority of an apostle, and he functioned as an apostle. I'm sure they wouldn't want him to do exactly what Judas had been doing, because that was, some of that was kind of negative.
It didn't work out too well.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you.
Not doing suicide.
Thank you. Yes. So, one of the things you can see from Eusebius is that we can get some of the backstory or additional details that aren't in the New Testament. And so, I think that is some of its benefit. In fact, some of the things we get, like, for example, the death of James, you can also read about it in Josephus, where Josephus talks about how, in addition to sort of being stoned, he was also hurled down. And then he describes James and said that his knees were like the knee. Oh, what I remember, he says his knees were like the knees of a camel. I don't know if you've ever seen the knees of a camel, but they have big pads on them because that's the way the camel gets up and down. So he said because he prayed so much, he had big calluses or big things on his knees, because he was a man who was in prayer all the time. Well, let's see. Oh, yes, Brian was eager previously. So let's see if we can... Yeah, this is not big enough now. Let's see, can I... I don't like this because it's not... let's see how this is going to work. Yeah, you can see it up there. I just, like it for people to be able to see the whole thing. But the problem is once I start one, then I have to stop it and start a whole new one to change this size. I think we'll just go with it. All right, Brian, are you ready? Brian will now persecute you. I mean, he'll talk about persecution.
Hello, class. My chapter was about the Great Persecution. First, start out the growth of Christianity. As was before the persecution, everything seemed to be going well. The rulers were generally okay with whatever you practice. Not only Christianity, but most religions, as long as you stuck with your religion, we'll stick with ours. Christians were allowed to pray. They were allowed to have their own churches. They were built. The church meetings and events were honored by the rulers or whoever was in charge. But like all good things, it came to an end with the success of the church and growth of it. Church members started to turn on each other. People started talking bad about each other. Each church started saying bad things about other people, trying to get more memberships.
I think he said, "Oh no, you didn't."
Yeah, and as the author put it, because this direct disobedience to the word of God, everything to come afterwards is kind of like punishment for them turning on each other when they were growing. Then we come to the destruction of churches, the start of the persecution. So the author is really vague about this part. He's afraid. He's only gonna tell the parts that benefit the future. I guess he meant like that showed us what not to do. And so is he said, he was like the only parts of history that will be told is the ones that will benefit the future generations and nothing more. Like what he said in the book. But it started during the month of March on the 19th year of Diocletian's reign. He ordered that churches be demolished and that sacred scriptures be burned. That was the decree. At the same time, during that time, he also put a decree that Christians who held high positions they were to lose their positions if they didn't sacrifice to pagan gods, and that families who continued practicing Christianity were to be imprisoned or killed. Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of killing soon. Yeah, or there's martyrs. So many of the church leaders endured the terrible torments heroically, while some were cowardly. There were a lot of people that were like, yeah, we're gonna die for what we believe in. You can burn us, kill us, whatever. We're not gonna sacrifice these pagan gods, we believe in God. And then others were who were just like, you know, we'll just make the sacrifice. It really isn't that big of a deal. We don't want to die. So he gave a long list of torture. So I didn't want to bore you with those details. So I'll just give you two lists. One was scrape to. It was a long list. One was scrape to death. I imagine that would be very painful. Another was scourge. I'm not really sure what that
Scourge.
was. Scourge.
That's being whipped.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So. But,
Straight to death.
like scrape, like peel skin off scrape.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, painful. But the author.
I think this crowd wants all the details about.
Oh, there's a lot more to come.
It's a very violent group, I can tell.
Yeah, the author made sure to point out that through all this torture, there are a lot of victims or martyrs who showed exceptional enthusiasm for worship before everything was peaceful and after. He was like, that's how you could tell who were real. They showed when everything was going good, they showed they were serving. Even after things got harder, like, we're still going to serve the Lord. Nothing's going to stop us. And after that, then Diocletian started going after the army, the Christians in the armies. He had the whole thing like, hey, if you're not going to sacrifice, he'll go each, like, I guess, like, section. Like, if you're not going to sacrifice, either you lose your position in the army, you lose your citizenship, or you just die. Like, it was, the way he said it was like a pick and choose. Like, either you could get chosen to, like, just leave the army, ooh, yay, or just, I'm going to kill you right on the spot. So that was one thing.
I think they used the smarter option.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to die either way, but I guess one will be faster than the other.
Well, we're all gonna die.
No, I mean, like, but.
I mean, I'm getting
What's that?
I'm getting a flaming chariot.
Ezekiel.
Then we have, like, when we're starting the first martyrs in Asia Minor. He did a backstory on how when the first decree was like, hey, all Christians must sacrifice, a guy was so, like, infuriated, he, like, tore the decree off and, like, ripped the paper up when a high person
don't
was
do
right
that.
there. They didn't say if he died or not. I guess he got away with it. They didn't say, oh, he ripped the paper. He also wanted to point out in this section how, like, the decree was for everyone, no matter what your position was or who you were. So he also gave another example of an imperious servant who was Peter, who was told, he was liked by his master. He was like one of the most well-liked servants. He was told to sacrifice.
Peter from the Bible.
No. This is different. I guess just a regular Peter. He was told to sacrifice pagan gods, and when he refused to, he was whipped and burnt very slowly.
Scourged, perhaps.
Yeah, scourged. And it was interesting because, like, throughout the story, I thought they meant burnt like witch burn. No, they, like, tied you up like a pig roast and rotated you and burnt you,
Yeah.
like, slowly.
Yeah, well, you know.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool.
You ever been to a pig picking?
I roasted a hog before,
See?
so I imagine that, and that doesn't seem very pleasant.
Put them on a metal spit and then roast them.
Yeah, I heard they said they were like put them on there and roast them.
I can see where this crowd is. What they get excited.
Like they'll
about.
put it on them, roast them. They'll be like, "Hey, are you gonna sacrifice me?" They'll be like, "No." They're like, "Okay, well, we're gonna keep roasting you," and just until the person just died, and then.
All right.
Hey, moving on.
Keep going.
Then he went on to say, when Metin and Syria,
Melitene.
apparently there was an attempt to overthrow the empire in those states. So, for that, he issued another decree that all the church leaders were to be chained and imprisoned, like just all of them.
Why not?
And if they sacrifice, they'll be saved. If not, they'll be tortured until they sacrifice. Have martyrs in Phoenicia and Egypt. In this one, it was pretty cool because he was like, when they chained up all the Christians to like in like the Colosseum, they were like release the animals to kill them. But for like a long time, none of the animals would touch them. It would go like up to like the guards and people on the stands. So that was like God's protection for people.
There you go.
I think they still died though, so
Well,
it was cool. It was like a good faith booster. Like, hey, we're doing the right thing.
straight.
Some martyrs, they were scraped, raped, and tortured in ways that are too horrible to describe, then drowned and
I
burned.
think that's racked.
Racked.
We're gonna rape you.
I was going along, I was like, yeah, right.
Rape, yeah.
Yeah, he's.
Part of this presentation, humor. I get it.
He gave those examples.
This is the most laughter I've ever heard about a presentation on persecution. Keep going.
He said those, then he was like, the other ways of torture were too horrible to describe, so he just left it at that.
Yeah.
So I'll leave that to your imaginations. Oh my god. Some martyrs were, I found this one really just horrible. Like for some people, they'll like kind of like pull the trees down, and then you like tie their legs to it, and then you let the tree go and like rip your limbs off as it go by.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that's creative, kind of. But yeah, while all this was going on, he said he's used a lot of this to show examples of like bravery and courage. So he was like, while people were getting ripped apart by these trees and burnt, people will come and confess their faith in Christianity to the judges themselves and just get put to death. So that takes a lot of bravery and courage.
Yes.
Two examples are, I'm gonna butcher these names. Philoromus. He was an important administrator, and then he was a bishop of Timus. Both were beheaded for their faith despite their wealth and power. Like he said, like even the judge would tell them, "Hey, don't do this."
Beheaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, it means they cut their head off.
Yeah.
That's how they were back to back, but facing each other.
Shouldn't it be D-headed, not B-headed?
No, they're beheaded. Keep going.
Myerson. Then this whole chapter is a whole bunch of other people dying, like all examples of like torture, torment, killing. One example game, a town was completely burnt to the ground. Like, I guess a couple people said they were Christian and they just went and burnt the whole town to a crisp. Like they didn't ask anyone to sacrifice, just burnt everything. And it literally just came to, and he was like, a lot of Christians, instead of like facing torment, they'll kill themselves. Especially the women, because if they were virgins or they didn't want to be defiled, they would just kill themselves. Like example of a mother and daughter, they threw themselves in the river, and another lady impaled herself on a sword before they could take her away. Then these are just well-known martyrs. I put two pictures there. The first one is the Bishop Anthimus of Nicomedia, and the second one's Tyrian, Bishop of Tyre. That's just showing them Tyre, yeah. That's just showing them getting beheaded. That was pretty cool. I hate you. Oh my god. Diocletian. Then they started saying, he went on to the Roman emperors. How as the power that their emperors grew, they became a little bit more or less tolerant towards people sometimes. That's how it started. It was like a little bio of Diocletian and the other emperors at the time. Basically, that they were like, hey, we don't really like the Christians, we're gonna kill them, and that the illness at the end apparently killed them, and there was like a divine, like, hey, that's your punishment for starting everything.
God struck him dead.
Yeah, so that was that. And then Constantine was more, he was a lot nicer. He was kind to people, didn't want to kill anyone, so was a plus for everyone. Everyone pretty much liked him for that. I find
that a plus for most people I'm around.
Yeah,
he was. If they want to kill me, I think that's a good thing.
They have Mac.
If Constantine was somewhat kind, what was like with sometimes when he was mean to the Christians?
Yeah, everyone just liked him because he didn't kill anyone. That was like
Such a great guy.
Yeah, he was a great guy for that one.
Kill everyone with a video game.
Yeah, he was like, y'all could just live. That's just.
All right, let's let him continue.
But this dude, the author said he only pretended to be Christian. He said, "Oh, Christians are cool. I'm a Christian," but only like word to get the support of people. But in the background, he was actually a really bad guy. He raped, killed, stole, and anything you think bad, he did. And then he just was horrible. Like he would take wives from husbands, rape them, and send them back, and then laugh at the husbands. He ordered the bodyguards to they said one drunken night, he literally just ordered his guards to go kill people, and he ended up killing like 1,000 Roman citizens, just for the heck of it. And he was like
He was bored.
Yeah, he was bored, I guess. And they were like his worst practice was practicing witchcraft. Like he was really heavy practicer. He would rip pregnant women's belly open and like study their entrails and like kill the babies and all that. And he like tried to invoke demons to prevent wars. He was a really messed up guy, actually. Yeah, Maximithia. He was referred to the tyrant in the East. He formed a secret alliance with the Roman Emperor. They were both bad people. He didn't really do anything without consulting his oracles, leading him to build temples of pagan gods in every city and killing pretty much everyone. He would rape. A story he said every town he visited, he would pick a whole bunch of women and rape and kill them and mutilate them, and just for the heck of it. And he especially liked picking on Christian women and allow them to kill themselves instead of being raped by him. And the persecution, the grace of God ended persecution, not the work of man or the pity or sympathies of man. It was all God. Galerius, who was blamed for the start, he was pretty much blamed for the whole thing. Like, hey, he's the one that really was orchestrating everything. He died a horrible death. People who couldn't heal him were put to death, and that was viewed as divine punishment. I was actually pretty curious on what killed him, and they said it was either gangrene or colon cancer. Yes, I looked up pictures and it was really horrible.
What's gangrene?
It's an infection.
You might want to look that up on your own.
Where your skin decays.
Yeah.
Everything decays, it gets green.
And gets nasty.
Bubbly.
Yeah, imagine someone die and like see a zombie, that's how it kind of looks. Yeah. Yeah.
Zombies.
That's what happened.
After he died, everyone, I guess they said everyone felt guilty and they were like, try to reverse everything that happened. And that was the end of that.
Is this the end of the persecution?
Yeah. That's really how the book ended. He
You're
was like,
done? Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions, or I won't ask for any comments, just questions.
Yeah.
It's a question. He was a Roman ruler that actually practiced witchcraft, right? And most of his predecessors of the Roman rulers that practiced witchcraft, right?
I wouldn't know.
I think according to
Or did both.
according to Eusebius.
Yeah, according to Eusebius, he practiced witchcraft. They didn't say anything about any other Roman.
All right, let's. We got one more question back there. You got it.
I looked up the guy who ripped up the thing. He was arrested for treason and burned alive.
There you go.
So we don't want to think he got off easy.
Yeah.
All right. That was the
The great persecution.
unbelievable. Now a different topic: the person and the work of Christ. Mostly less violent.
Slightly less topical.
I hope so.
So this chapter was about the person and work of Christ. So first, Eusebius talks about the nature of Christ and how it's twofold. How Christ was considered the head of the body and part of the Godhead, and also the feet in terms of how he stepped down into humanity to identify with us. And that was declared through the prophecy of the Holy Spirit when Isaiah wrote it in chapter 53. And he was considered the first and only offspring of God, the commander-in-chief of heaven's spiritual host, which is God. And he was the agent of his Father's plan, so executing on earth what his Father had intended. And he was considered higher than an angel. Then he goes into detail about the difference between Jesus and the Christ. So when Moses wrote about it, he was honored to announce the sanctified and glorious name of Christ and his character. And it was also a foreshadow of who the successor of Moses would be, which is Joshua, but pronounced Hoshea, which is bearing the Savior's image. And high priests and kings also carried the name of Christ as they were anointed, but none of them gained the divine power like Jesus, nor were they worshipped or honored like Jesus was across the world, even to this day. And he talks about the antiquity of true faith, which is how Jews knew about Christianity and Christ long before Jesus ever came along. So they knew Christ as the one who appeared to Abraham, who taught Isaac, who spoke to Jacob, and conversed with Moses and prophets in later scripture. And Jesus' birth and the end of Jewish dynasty is when the Romans handed over the government to Herod, who was a half Jew and a foreigner. And so, though Herod was a half Jew, he did not retain any qualities of the priestly governance, so he kept it all to himself, and therefore the lineage of Jewish rulers ceased, and therefore confusion ensued. There's two different genealogies that have a lot of conflict with each other, which is the recordings of Matthew and Luke in the Gospels, and Africanus writes in his letter that the reason the genealogy varies between both of them is because how they interpreted family lineage. Some, I don't know who, but one of them included all the fathers who had died without having any children or families, and another one included them. So that was one of the big reasons why they both carry different genealogy perspectives. And he records how Mary belonged to the same tribe as Joseph in Africanus' letter. During Jesus' time, when the Magi came asking where the Messiah was to be born, Herod sent out an edict to massacre all the infants that we all know about, 2 years and under, throughout the area of Bethlehem, which is in Micah's prophecy, and that's how Herod knew about it. And so, since Joseph and Mary knew or heard about this through an angel, they fled to Egypt, and then because of this edict that Herod sent out, he suffered a lot of punishment under the scourge of God, physical ailments, just very torturous punishment that God handed to him. And so after his death, Joseph is directed back to Judea, by an angel. He also talks about John the Baptist and Jesus. If we look, Herodias asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter, and therefore that was what Herod executed John the Baptist, and we find that later, because of John's persecution, the entire army of Herod was destroyed, and Herod is later stripped of kingship and exiled to Vienna, which is in Gaul, which is a city in Gaul, with Herodias. And though we typically hear of the 12 disciples of Jesus, there was way more than 12. We see them going 2 by 2, which is the 70 disciples. And we also see that when Jesus appeared after his resurrection, he's first seen by Cephas after, and then he's seen by the 12, then the 500, and Jesus' brother James. And Thaddeus was sent out by Thomas, who was divinely inspired by God, to send him as a preacher and an evangelist to the city of Edessa. Yeah, where King Abgar was on the throne, who was struck with an incurable illness. And so King Abgar actually wrote a letter to Jesus to come and heal him. And Jesus wrote back that he wouldn't come, but that he promised to send his disciple. And he ended up sending one of his disciples, and King Abgar is healed. And yeah.
That's not in the Bible.
It's in the Africanist letter.
It's not in my Bible. Very good. Well, any questions and or comments? I'm always afraid to ask. Yes, go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
You know where it says, a couple times you said God, struck the Herod with like pain and illness and stuff. Does it actually say that in the Bible?
That's in Africanist letter.
Okay.
Yeah, so one thing we're going to see here as we look at the writings of Eusebius is that they give us insights that we don't have from the Bible. Obviously, there's some stuff, there's parallel material, but then there are some things he drops in there that are not in the New Testament about the church, not in the book of Acts or whatever. Those are the things then that get incorporated into what some people have called church tradition, church teaching, early teachings. For example, the story about Edessa. Edessa, I've been to the city of Edessa. It's currently in Turkey, and it was a part of Syria, and it became a crusader city. If you study the Crusades, Edessa becomes a center of one of the crusader states later on. So this early connection with Jesus or the disciples and so forth, and say what the disciples do, where they go, who sends them. A lot of these things are not recorded in the book of Acts, or not recorded in the New Testament. And so these, did these things happen or not? Well, Eusebius says yes. So we can say, well, it's not in the Bible, but Eusebius says it. For example, we just went right over it because people often say it, but for example, that Paul was beheaded, when we talked about persecution, Paul is beheaded, and Peter is crucified upside down. That's not in the Bible. We don't have anything about their execution in the Bible. We find that out from Eusebius. Eusebius records that. And so many of these things that we some of them we incorporate in freely, and a lot of people know them, and they say, well, yeah, this is what happened to Paul, this is what happened to Peter. Again, are not in the Bible. And so Eusebius, I think, is a credible source. Obviously, it's not Bible, it's not the same as the Bible, but gives us some backgrounds and interesting information, to which we can add other things, like the writings of Josephus and others. But he also, he talks about the persecutions, he goes all the way up to Diocletian, which of course is much later. So we jump from Nero all the way to Diocletian, and so we find out a lot of details about how Christians were persecuted there. As well as some of the theological things that he talks about. It's just interesting to get his perspective. He was a bishop. He was a church leader. Eusebius was sort of the right-hand man of the Emperor Constantine, and he was the guy that Constantine relied upon quite a bit. Now, how many people still haven't done their presentations? On Eusebius?
Yeah.
And you, Eusebius? And you see, we got 3 people. All right, well, we'll do those on Monday then. So I think we are out of time.